G'day so-and-sos, welcome to our sewing room. My name is Kathy. Cruising around back there somewhere is Lucy Purr. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about my top 10 tips that I would give to every beginner sewer. Now, I have compiled this list based off things that I remember driving me nuts when I was trying to teach myself how to sew, and also of the most commonly posted questions and frustrations that I see on social media. So let's just jump right into it with the first one. And the first tip focuses around on your machine eating your fabric. So this is the most common one that I see people posting on social media. So let's head over to the sewing machine and have a look. Something I did a lot when I first started learning how to sew, and something I see beginners do all the time, is they will start to sew and then their fabric gets sucked down into these gaps where the feed dog is and then down into this hole. Then they get this big bird's nest of thread and their fabric gets stuck, and you have to pull the screws out, pull the plate off and try and fix it. Now, the reason that this happens is maybe a couple of things. So when you start sewing, you want to not have your fabric right at the edge. So see how my fabric is just underneath the needle there. Well, maybe not on this machine because this machine is extremely forgiving. But if I started sewing here, my feed dogs, these things here that move up and down as you sew and catch your fabric. So see how this one is moving up and down? The one on the other side is grabbing my fabric, and as I stitch, it's moving it along. If you start sewing right on the edge of your fabric, then the feed dogs can't really engage, especially on a domestic machine. And so what will happen is they'll just sort of chew your fabric and it'll get sucked down in there. Now, this machine too is a industrial. So if I tried to sew a really light fabric on this, a really satiny type fabric, or even just a normal quilting one without any interfacing on the back, the same thing might happen. It might, well, I mean, I know it would just chew it up because it doesn't like it. So when you start sewing, you want to make sure that you have a little bit of fabric underneath, or if you really want to start sewing right on the edge, then you can use a scrap piece of fabric as a lead-in. So what I would do is pop this bit down and then have the fabric that I want to start sewing on, like that. I would start sewing across the scrap and then let it go onto my nice piece of fabric. Now, when you do this as well, it sort of has another benefit, that your stitches will look nice right on the end. So because I've used that lead-in piece of fabric, then my stitches are already nice. If I started just on this piece, and we'll back stitch as well, so if I started up here and went forward and then back, it might be a little bit messy as I've sewn. Actually, it's come out pretty good. And again, this machine is just so forgiving. But if I did that and I was quick and a little bit lazy, I might have a bit of a bunch up on here and a little bit of a bunch up on there. If I use this piece first and sew, even if I get onto my nice fabric and then backstitch here, my feed dogs and everything else are already in motion. They're already working, so it just ends up being a little bit neater. Now, the most second common frustration that I see posted online is about skipped stitches, and we've all been there. Now, there's a number of reasons why skipped stitches might happen, but typically for the beginner, it's when you're changing from one level to another. So for me as a bag maker, I will be sewing along and then I'll come up to a connector tab or a strap or something like that, where my fabric then changes height. Now, if you're a quilter or if you're making clothes or something like that, then you'll encounter it when you're sewing along and then you come to a bit where there's a seam underneath and then you're going up over the seam. And what will happen is that you get a skipped stitch right before you go up and over that seam. So let's have a look at the sewing machine. I'll show you what I mean and I'll show you how to fix it. Now this next one is especially true for someone like me because I'm a bag maker. And what that means is I can be sewing along on a nice flat piece of fabric and then I'll come up to a strap or a connector tab or a gusset and all of a sudden I have a big chunky piece in the way. And what happens is your presser foot is nice and flat here, but then when it comes up to this big chunky bit, all of a sudden, and again, this machine's so forgiving, but all of a sudden the front part of the presser foot is raised and the back isn't going to be. So as you sew, it really doesn't like it. So what you can do is use a hump jump or another piece of fabric. Okay, that's a great example there. Have a look at that. That is a big skip stitch there as it tried to go up and over that. So that's what will happen. So what you want to do, oh, look at it, hated that. My thread got all twisted up and everything else. So another good tip here, before I rethread my machine, I'm going to turn it off. You do not want to be rethreading your machine or having your fingers anywhere near that needle when it has the opportunity to move. And we'll get to that one in a minute. But you do not want a needle through your finger. And it doesn't matter if it's a domestic machine, like this one's an industrial, it would just sew through your finger. But a domestic is just as capable of doing it. So don't make the mistake of thinking that you're safe with that. So let's go this way. So if I'm sewing along and I get to this big bit here, I want to make sure that I am popping something underneath the back of my presser foot. So now my presser foot again is nice and even. And then I can keep sewing, keeping my fingers away from the needle until it's flat again. And it will be a bit better. Oh yeah, there. I've got a nice stitch there and a nice stitch there. It's just hard to see because it joins right there. But no skip stitch like on that end. Now the next tip, well, it's a couple of tips really, is about how to cut a straight line and get your piece of fabric nice and square. Now this is something that I say on socials all the time, but if you just follow these couple of tips, it will make life so much easier. So the first one, I see people saying all the time that, suggesting use a rotary cutter when you cut. And then the person responds saying, I don't like rotary cutters because they don't cut very well. They grab and pull and everything else. If your rotary cutter isn't just sliding along nice and smooth, it's more than likely because you have this nut on the back too tight. So because it's a very sharp blade and everything else, people tend to, really tighten up that nut thinking that they're being safe. But it actually wants to be just a little bit loose. You just want to give it a little bit of slack in that. And see how I'm keeping my finger on there when I do that because I don't want that blade, any sort of risk of it falling off. So the other reason that your rotary cutter might be skipping and not cutting your fabric nicely is you might have accidentally put two blades in there. And that can happen really easy because the blades are sort of oiled up when you buy them, then they do tend to stick together. So if your rotary cutter isn't cutting nice and smooth, just check and make sure you've only got one blade in there and that nut is just a little bit, you've just eased off the tension a little bit so that it can move. Now, rotary cutter blades do need to be changed out. I do it around the same amount of hours as my needle on my sewing machine. I change out my needle every 8 hours of sewing or really once every project if I'm making a bag. And I do the same with my rotary cutter. Before the beginning of every, Lucy's got the zoomies, she's chasing a fly around the room if you can hear that, sorry. So if I'm starting a new project or a new bag, I change out my needle and I change out my rotary cutter so I'm starting fresh and I don't risk wrecking any fabric. Now, the second part of this is to use your acrylic ruler with your rotary cutter. But if you, and this is for safety and for straight lines, if you just use your hand, then it risks sliding around like that. And you also risk it sliding and you coming up and cutting your fingers, and you don't want that. Always have your fingers steepled like that, not flat. So if you do accidentally skip up, there's less chance of cutting yourself. And use something to hold your ruler down in place. So I've pinched one of the weights of a weight bar that I've got in here, or you can use a really good, like a big tin of beans or tomatoes or something, just something with a little bit of weight in it. So then I will line up my ruler along my fabric where I want to cut. Have that up there because it's usually the top end that will go screw-if on you. Have my fingers down here. I know that my blade is good, and I can just zip up along there. And then I've got my cut. Now to get my fabric square, I will leave my ruler there and then start my second cut along there like that, so that I know I have a nice right angle there. Then I can move my weight, line up my ruler this way so that my ruler is lined up with the edge of that, and it's lined up with the edge of that start of the cut up there. So I know that I'm nice and square. Pop my weight back on there, pop my blade back out, and finish my cut. Cool. So then I know that I have a nice square bit there. So when I want to cut down on this end, I can just line up the edge of my fabric along that edge there. And then I know that that is straight. Pop my weight back up the top there. Up that side. That's nice and straight. And then I can pivot, line up the edge of my ruler up along that top one so that I can get this side nice and square as well. Pop my weight back up on there. And then I have a nice square piece. Well, you know, it's a rectangle, but my corners are nice and square. Now, this next tip is something that we have all done or we are all going to do. And if I'd known about it earlier, it would have saved me a couple of irons. So this is interfacing. And yes, I just deliberately ironed a piece of interfacing onto the iron plate. So what do we do about that? I see people posting about this all the time, and the recommendations people will give them is to use a scourer or use iron cleaner or oven cleaner and a whole heap of other abrasive things, but it's really quite easy. So I've actually stuck it on there a couple of times. So I've got burnt bits there, and then I've got some glue on here. Now, it didn't actually stick a whole lot on there, a whole lot of the glue, because I've done this to this iron before, and it's actually got a little bit of protection on there. Now, what I'm talking about is dryer sheets. So these are the nice smelly dryer sheets that you put in with your towels and clothes into your dryer to make everything smell nice. And these things work like magic and actually then leave a little bit of protection on your iron as well. So I'm going to use a cloth so that I don't burn my fingers. And I've turned my iron off and it's cooled down for just a little minute, but it's still a bit warm. So I'll get my cloth, get my dryer sheet, fold that over a couple of times, and then I will wipe my iron over, and it will just take all of that burnt glue off there. Now, when it does it, it also leaves a bit of a coating over my iron as well. So the next time that I do it, it will just not stick very well. Like you saw then, like I was able to just peel that interfacing off because I've done this to it a few times, like rubbed it over with a dryer sheet. So it's got a bit of a protective sheen over it. And that is all of that off. Now, oh, see how shiny it is? Before you go and iron anything else with that, do give it a bit of a wipe down with a clean cloth because you don't want that sort of oily sheen to be going onto your fabric. So again, I demo this in a couple of shorts and a couple of other videos where it's like really stuck on there. And also with my really big press down iron where I've accidentally had a big sheet of interfacing and pressed that really heavy, really hot iron down on top of it and just had glue everywhere. Wipe it over with one of these and it just comes off. And your room will smell fabulous. So the most common answer to any problem that someone will post about, whether the machine's jamming up or the stitches look terrible or the machine just won't sew properly, the most common answer to that query is you have threaded your machine wrong. And the most common reply to that answer is, but I've threaded it 100 times and it's still doing it. Now, you threaded it 100 times, but you've probably threaded it wrong 100 times. So when I say that you've threaded it wrong, I don't mean that you haven't followed the arrows of where your thread is meant to go. It's that you've actually missed a couple of these crucial tips along the way. And the main thing that you want to make sure that you are doing from the moment that you start threading is that your presser foot is in the up position. Now, when your presser foot is up, the tension discs are open and your thread can fit in there nicely. If your presser foot is in the down against the bed position when you are threading your machine, those tension discs are closed and your thread won't fit up in there properly. Now, it doesn't matter if you get your thread through the needle and then you lift your foot and you pull it. It's not going to sit in that tension disc correctly. And no matter how many times you try and sew, your machine will just jack up. It just does not like it. So you always need to make sure that your presser foot is up when you are threading your machine. Now, along with that, you also need to make sure that when you are threading your machine, that you are only turning the flywheel on the side of your machine towards you. If you sew it backwards, then everything's going in reverse. Think about like if you tried to drive down the highway in reverse, your car's not going to like it. Police probably won't either, but your machine's not going to like that wheel going in reverse. So always make sure that you are turning your machine forward whenever you can. The only time I would ever turn my wheel backwards is if I do have a jam or something like that. And the only way I can get that jam to release is to turn the wheel backwards a little bit. So press a foot up and you're only turning that wheel towards you. Now, another thing that you have to do when you are threading your machine is to do so with the needle in the highest position. So you want to turn your flywheel forward towards you until the needle is in its highest position. Okay, so you've got your presser foot up and you haven't even started threading yet. Your presser foot is up. You have turned that flywheel towards you so that your needle is in the highest position. That means that your needle is up and the tension discs are open. Now you can go ahead and thread your machine. So this next tip, I'll sort of show you two tips in one. So it's about precision, that's hard to say with a lisp, about being accurate when you're sewing, precision, you know what I mean? So for example, if I want to sew around this box because I'm doing a zipper box, then I want to make sure that it's nice and neat and perfect on both sides, especially if it's a zipper that's on the outside of my bag, because that's a real feature. And if it's just a little bit longer on one end or a little bit wider on the other, it will be obvious. So I really want to pay attention to detail. So let's hop over to the sewing machine and I'll show you a couple of tips around that. So when I do this, I want to start right on one of those corners that I made. So let's say that I am sewing along. I'm going to sew along that line. I'm not watching my needle. And when I get down to this end, I want to make sure that I'm landing right on that corner. So I'm still just a tiny, tiny little bit away, but I know if I drop in one more stitch, I'm going to go past it. So what I'll do is actually shorten my stitch length right down. So I can see that I've only got a tiny little bit left to go. So I've shortened my stitch length down to around a 1.5 and just drop in that one more stitch so that I land on my corner. So that's the first tip. I'll lengthen my stitch length back up to what it was as I was sewing. Now the second tip is to leave my needle down in my work. So if I do that, I can lift my presser foot and move my fabric safely without it going everywhere. If I was here, I think it's obvious, but I'll show you, and I didn't have my needle down in my work, then I'm going to have this big long bit, which is going to be another stitch, which could all possibly come loose because it's not back stitched. And then I'm going to have a little bit of a harder time dropping my needle back in on my corner. So I've missed there, and then I'd have to go back up and try again, and then I've got it. But now I've also got a big bunch of thread. So you want to make sure that your needle is down and then you turn so that you don't get all that messy bit there. Now, if you are a regular viewer of my channel, you would have seen me use these things before and you would have heard me bang on about them as well. I absolutely love these, and I think these are absolutely crucial for any sewer, beginner or otherwise, for so many reasons. And I'll show you a couple of them over at the sewing machine in a moment. These are sewing stilettos, and these particular ones are called That Little Purple Thing, THANG. And you can get these from sewing stores, you can get them sewing shops online, you can get them off Amazon, and you can get them off Temu. No matter where you get them from, they're pretty much the same. They are just a plastic stiletto and they're shaped the same. I think this one was one of the original ones, and then the other ones are off Temu. And the original one just feels maybe a little bit harder than these ones. These ones are a little bit more flexible, but it makes zero difference. The only difference was this one was about 20 bucks, where off one of the cheaper apps that you can buy stuff off, you can get 4 or 5 of these for a couple of dollars. And I have them absolutely everywhere, at every machine and at the table, and yeah, I love them. So let's have a little look over at the sewing machine and I'll show you what we use them for. But you don't want to be getting your fingers anywhere near the needle at your sewing machine. So this is a great extension of your hand, but I'll show you how I use it. Now, it is really easy to teach yourself how to sew with one of these things. It just becomes an extension of your hand, and it just keeps your fingers away from that needle. So as I'm sewing, instead of having my fingers here, or if something gets stuck trying to shove it in with my finger, I'm using this. So my fingers aren't going to be anywhere near that needle. Now, something else that's really good for, and especially for final, especially when we're talking about skip stitches, is to hold your fabric down as you sew in front of your needle. Now, vinyl is a little bit sticky, like not sticky like dirty, but it's a little bit grabby, it's a little bit resistant. So the needle goes down into it and the vinyl doesn't want to let the needle go because it's got that resistance. And as you sew, it can actually lift. The vinyl can lift just here in front of your needle. And not just vinyl, some other fabrics would do it as well. And when that happens, when that fabric lifts a little bit, you'll get a skipped stitch because the needle is releasing the thread as it goes down into the bobbin case. The bobbin case is coming around and hooking that thread and making a nice stitch. When the vinyl hangs onto it, that thread on your needle is releasing a second too late. Now, don't worry too much if that doesn't make sense. Just know that if the vinyl hangs onto the needle, you don't get a nice stitch. So the other thing this is good for is to hold that vinyl down as we sew so it doesn't have the opportunity to lift. And that means I'm not getting my fingers anywhere near that needle and I have nice stitches. Now, the next little set of tips is around how to sew in a straight line. Now, sewing in a straight line can be really difficult when you're first learning how to sew for a couple of reasons, and I'll explain a little bit more when we're over at the sewing machine. But I'll give you one quick tip while we're still here. So this is a friction pen. It's a Pilot Friction, Frixion pen, and it's just a normal pen that you use to draw on paper. But it's heat erasable, and I find this thing works better than any fabric pen that I have ever used, and it completely disappears with heat. So if you just give it a bit of a hit with the iron, it's gone. So what you can do, if I know that I want to sew on this edge at a 1 inch seam allowance, let's say, just to be able to give myself plenty of room to show you, I can actually draw that line on that piece of fabric. And then that will give me a bit of a marker to be able to follow at the sewing machine. Now, this will work on some projects, and on some projects or parts of a project, it won't, because it'll just be too hard to draw that line on. So I'll show you another tip over at the sewing machine. But this is just one that you can think about doing if you are like at the beginning of your project. If I was to be, sewing this panel in and I want a 1/2 inch or 1 inch seam allowance on each side as my first step, that's a good way to do it, so that your first step is nice and neat, which is going to help you build the rest of your project. But let's take this over to the sewing machine and I'll show you a couple of other things that you can do. Now, most beginner sewers will be using a domestic machine, and domestic machines will have lines down along the side here, usually at a 1/4 inch, 3/8, 1/2, 3/4, and 1 inch. And you can line up your fabric along the edge so that it is lined up with the seam allowance that you want. Now, some machines, like mine, being an industrial, and some other even domestic machines, might not have those lines on there, or some plates might not have those lines on there. So what you can do is use a piece of tape. So you can pop a piece of tape down along your needle plate there at the seam allowance that you like. Now, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of this method, and I generally don't use it because I can be sewing and go wonky and cover up the bit of tape anyway. So another thing that you can do is use a seam guide magnet like this one. Now, again, you really have to make sure that you have measured your seam allowance from your needle to where you want it, and that your magnet is nice and straight. This is a little bit better because it's a little bit harder for you to go over it. So it'll sort of keep it in place there a little bit better. So if I'm sewing, let's say I'm sewing along that line that I did, what I want to do is not watch my needle. What I want to do is watch my line where it joins up in between here. So I'm watching right here and here. I'm watching that line that I drew as it meets my presser foot. And then that way I'm not watching my needle. If you watch your needle, you will go wonky. So that's all well and good if I can actually draw on my fabric. But when you're top stitching like what I'm doing, there will be some sort of a guide. You'll be sewing next to a seam or next to another stitch or something like that. So you'll have something that you can watch. Or if you do have those lines on your plate, you'll be watching here. So if you have those lines and you're sewing along, you won't be watching your needle, you won't be watching your foot. You'll be watching your fabric here and keeping it on that line. It's natural to try and watch your needle, but that is the last place that you want to look. So this last tip is, well, I say it at the end of all of my videos. It's only fabric, we can always buy more. But let's expand on that a little bit. I see all the time on sewing pages, and I'm terrible for doing it myself, where if a project doesn't come out as we hope that it would, or if we mess it up along the way to the point where that really can't be saved and we have to throw it out and start again, we get so frustrated with ourselves. We feel like it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, it's a waste of fabric. I've bought this expensive machine and I suck. And just, I see it all the time where people are like, I'm going to sell my machine because I'm no good at this. And that just, it really does break my heart, because sewing is meant to be fun. So if we think about it, it's not a waste of time because you're learning something new. If you made a mistake, hopefully you learned something new from it, and you probably won't make that mistake again in the future. So that's a positive thing. You know, you've bought this machine for yourself so that you have something for yourself that you enjoy, and that you are being creative, and you are allowing that part of your brain to explore and play. Not all of our time has to be making money. Like, I don't make a whole lot of money from this, and I spend a heap of time out in my sewing room filming these videos for very little money, but the intrinsic reward that I get is absolutely huge. And it's the intrinsic reward, that feeling of, you know, I'm enjoying this, I'm having fun, that we should be focusing on when we're sewing, even when we stuff it all up. So it's only fabric, you know, it's only a piece of material. It's only fabric, man. Like, it's only fabric. Don't break yourself up over it if you stuff up, make a mistake, and then have to throw it out or use it for stuffing in a toy or a pillow or something else. I have got a whole drawer full of fabric where I've made a mistake, and then I've either run out of that fabric, so I haven't been able to continue on, or I've just cut it the wrong size and it's too small or whatever. So I've got a whole drawer full that I use for then stuffing stuff, or, you know, stuffing up my bags when they're on display, or using to demo stuff like today, or, you know, using as that lead-in piece of fabric for something else, or testing my stitches on. It's only fabric. It's not going to end the world if you have to chuck it or use it for something else. So enjoy what you are doing. You are allowed to make mistakes. You're allowed to stuff up. You're allowed to be human. You're allowed to waste all day if you go wrong somewhere on a project. So long as you've had fun and you've learnt something along the way, then it's never a waste of time. Okay. All right, guys. Well, that's it for me today. And I'll say it again. Remember, it's only bloody fabric. We can always buy more, and we deserve to. We are allowed to be happy, and we're allowed to have our hobby, and we're allowed to enjoy ourselves. Okay, guys, have a fabulous weekend, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Bugger.